Hey everybody, I'm putting together a brief micro-lecture here to talk about some of the highlights of Chapter 4 that I think are worth talking about. They're not the only things you should be concerned about. I want you to read the entire chapter, make sure you take the quiz, make sure you really understand all the concepts in this chapter, but I'm going to hit on some of the highlights. So what you want to be able to do when you're done with Chapter 4 is discuss the rise of international business and describe the major world marketplaces, trade agreements, and alliances. They're pretty significant. They're in the news a lot, so it's worth learning about them. You also want to be able to explain how differences in import-export balances happen. Exchange rates and foreign competition determine the ways in which countries and businesses respond to the international environment. Discuss the factors involved in deciding to do business internationally and in selecting the appropriate levels of international involvement and international organizational structure. That you have to be very creative if you're going to expand into international markets. There are lots of different things that come into play. There's a very important importance of cultural environment in international business. It's huge. It's also one of the most interesting things about doing international business is to learn more about other cultures, the way other people do things, what's important to them. It's one of the most fascinating things you can do in business. That's just my own opinion, and I've done it a lot, so I really enjoy it all around the world. Describe some of the ways in which economic, legal, and political differences also affect international business, and they clearly do. So there's lots of challenges to deciding to take your products international. Okay, I want to talk about one thing because I think it's really interesting. There's a definite shift in the global economy. And this is a fairly dated study. It was at the end of 2016, but it's still true. It's not, maybe the numbers aren't 100% as accurate today or more telling today. But whatever the trends are that I'm going to talk about here are definitely still happening. So on a global level, we're witnessing the most rapid expansion of the middle class the world has ever seen. And that's clear. And so the middle class, and that's judged by, economists. We think of middle class as being a kind of a way to live or of a section of society. For us, it's defined more in terms of purchasing power as far as economists are concerned. And what's driving it is China and India. So even though China and India, China in particular, but India have had a little bit of struggle with their economy since 2020, they're still growing and they're still strong and they're still huge economic engines. Actually, China and India, the growth of the middle class is like 6%, and those are two huge countries. The U.S., Eurozone, and Japan is really relatively flat, and in fact, it's even on the decline. So that's what makes China and India interesting markets to look to expand into. So let's talk a little bit about the major countries that are our biggest trading partners. I think sometimes people are a little bit surprised to see that it's Mexico and Canada are at the top. That's not too surprising given that we had an agreement in place and still have a different version of the agreement in place that was called NAFTA that started during the Clinton administration. And that really freed up our trading restrictions with Mexico and Canada, which effectively meant we moved a whole lot of manufacturing over from the United States into Mexico and Canada. And I just as a kind of side note, I remember many years ago looking at Juarez right across from Texas and seeing this sleepy little border town. And, after NAFTA was in place and a few years after that, you stood in the same place and looked, and you saw huge manufacturing facilities built all over, just across the border. And the reason is simple, is that the labor is quite a bit less in Mexico than it is in the United States. So that actually was, NAFTA was essentially eliminated and replaced under the Trump administration. But that still, didn't really change it too much in terms of, who the major trading partners were with the United States and how much we do with those two countries. The United States is known as we are in a trade deficit. In other words, we import more than we export. And there's lots and lots of reasons for that, but this is always a little bit concerning for people to see, but nonetheless, I think it's it's how we do business. I like, these are just for fun, the most made in USA cars, because, we tend to think of manufacturers as being the key driver of whether a car is domestically produced or not. And in fact, that's not true. Okay. So, because everybody thinks, Honda is in Japan. Yes, it is. That's where its corporate headquarters are, but they produce a whole lot of cars and light trucks in the U.S. Okay. So, the number one, I think this is still true, but this is a little bit dated, but is the Jeep Cherokee, which is made in Belvidere, Illinois, which is on your way to Rockford. If you look off to the right, you'll see a huge auto manufacturing plant. And you'll see that's where the Jeep Cherokee is made. So that was actually primarily made, and when it said most made in USA cars, because when you think about cars as being a conglomeration of a lot of different parts, not all those parts come from the U.S. So we could say where it's assembled, but that doesn't mean as much as where do all the different parts come from. So that's where the term most made in the USA are the parts domestically sourced. And that's not, I guess it would be surprising for some folks, but the Honda Odyssey and the Honda Ridgeline, which are light trucks, minivan and a light truck, are primarily made with parts and assembled, and they're also assembled in the United States, so they're right up at the top of the list. So as you go down the list, it's not surprising you see a lot of different car companies, and you say, well, those aren't U.S. car companies. Yeah, but the cars that they sell here are. Okay, and this is just another way of looking at it. What percentage of the total product line of these U.S. car companies, as we would call them, is made in the U.S. Tesla is 100%. I don't know that that's still true, but it was true at one time. Jeep was quite a bit more. But if you go down to the lower part, you'll see Toyota actually makes more percentage of their cars are made in the U.S. than even Buick. And you say, well, how could that possibly be? But I can tell you this, Buick is one of the number one, at the top of the list of import cars sold. They're manufactured now, but from non-Chinese car companies sold in China. So that's why Buick is still around and sells lots and lots of cars in China, and makes lots of cars in China, and that's why that looks that way. Okay, so that about wraps it up. I think there's a couple of things that we need to talk about as well. Barriers to international trade. We'll hear about quotas, and these things are all currently practiced quite a bit. There's quotas in terms of restricting the number of products of a certain type that can be imported into a country. There's embargoes. That's just banning exportation and or importation of a particular product from a particular country. We currently have an embargo with Iran. As an example, okay? And then it's pretty common for countries to levy tariffs, which are basically taxes on things coming into their country, and there's lots of ways to get around that, but you certainly have to find those, because tariffs can be very costly. And one of the things you're going to be asked to comment on is whether the SIF tariffs that were put in place under the Trump administration were appropriate. Who do they help? Who do they hurt? Those kinds of things, because they definitely do both, right? So yeah, those are key things that are barriers to international trade, and it's largely driven out of something called protectionism, which is the basic idea is we're going to try to protect our domestic producers of different products and businesses, and we're going to try to protect them in the face of foreign competition. And that's why we might actually put some tariffs and things like that in place. We protect it. And we would not be the only ones who do this, because other countries do that. For example, I remember India putting a 75% tariff on Harley-Davidson motorcycles being imported exported from here into India. And that would create obviously an untenable situation for Harley-Davidson, so they actually opened a manufacturing plant in India, and that was their way of getting around it. But then it kind of came back, and Harley owners were made aware that Harley-Davidson made the decision to start manufacturing motorcycles in India, and that really created an uproar. And they had a lot of PR spending to do to make sure that got taken care of. But it was a pretty dramatic thing. Most of you are not old enough to remember this. I am. We had an embargo of oil from the OPEC, which is oil-producing countries have kind of a consortium, if you will, but it's a pact that decided to put an embargo on oil imports into the United States. That created gasoline shortages. This was back in the early 70s, and what you're seeing in that picture was the effect of that. You could only buy gas on odd and even days based on what your last number on your license plate said, and these were the lines to get gas. It was that scarce at the time. So yeah, it's pretty dramatic stuff that can come from all these different types of policy decisions, and point out some of the pitfalls that we have in doing international business. Okay, so those are the key things. Make sure you read the entire chapter, take the quiz. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.